All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our 5G series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Graham. I'm a partner in Phil Fisher's Telecom Sector Group. I'm delighted to be joined today by James Walsh, who is a fellow partner in our Telecom Sector Group. So for those of you who've been following the webinar series, the first two webinars looked at the phased nature of 5G rollout and the requirements for increased fibre connectivity to ensure that 5G's potential can be met. We then spoke last time about the cost reduction opportunities there were in terms of deploying renewable energy in mobile networks. And this latest webinar will focus on a really hot topic in the industry, which is Open RAN, and look at some of the cost reduction and network management deployment opportunities, and also some of the associated challenges for network operators. So if we can go to the agenda slide. So I'm going to cover the key features and benefits of Open RAN technology, look at some of the deployment options and potential barriers to adoption. And then with what I can only call impeccable timing, given that the Telecom Security Bill is due to be published today, James will look at some of the network security issues that may arise and discuss how security of Open RAN technology is going to be regulated in the UK. So if we can go to the next slide. So I guess the obvious thing to start off is, well, actually, what do we mean by Open RAN, and what are the key drivers? And I guess essentially Open RAN is the ability to deploy, integrate and operate radio access networks. So in other words, the tower infrastructure, antennas and base stations using components, systems and software sourced from multiple vendors. And as operators enter the 5G era, the desire is for radio access networks to be increasingly software driven and based on open interfaces, with some of the larger vendors migrating from integrated single vendor systems to more modular open platforms. At least that's the ideal world panacea that operators would like to see. And the movement, the Open RAN movement, can be seen, I think, as a reaction to the limitations of the current model and the fact that open practices in adjacent industries such as cloud networking can be applied to the telecom sector to deliver cost-effective solutions and faster innovation cycles. And so the key drivers, if you like, for Open RAN are the following. So vendor diversity and the overall ecosystem. I think nearly everyone in the UK would agree that there's a strategic need for greater diversity and choice in the supply chain. This has been highlighted over a number of years, and it's telling that when the UK operators were discussing what vendors would replace Huawei equipment within their networks by the 2027 deadline, they consider that there are in essence two viable large-scale equipment operators in the UK, that being Ericsson and Nokia. And although Samsung also has a limited footprint in the UK, due to the issue about single RAN technology, which we'll discuss later, there are still limitations in terms of choice of vendors for operators that are out there. And so the other key drivers for Open RAN are the need for open interfaces and to be able to program the RAN. So open interfaces between RAN, centralized unit, distributed unit and radio unit subsystems. I think there's a view within the operator community that is what we need to aim for in order that operators can create best of breed solutions. And within that open architecture, one of the key benefits is that specialist software developers can get real-time access to radio resources and improve system performance and innovation through novel solutions. So essentially, by disaggregating and moving functionality to modular software that runs on high volume general purpose hardware, that introduces a cloud operations model leveraging high levels of automation, and that'll be critical to the Open RAN business case. And the last key driver on the slide is the need for automation of service management and network orchestration. When we spoke in the second webinar about network slicing, actually that automation of service management is going to be key if 5G delivers in terms of a network slicing vision. So if we can go on to the next slide. So there is a bit of jargon here, so apologies in advance, but we'll try and keep it as simple as I can. So this is a traditional radio access network with the baseband unit at the foot of the antenna and the remote radio unit close to the antennas to avoid signal attenuation. So typically the baseband unit acts as a switchboard to improve connections between radio equipment and connects data and signals to multiple endpoints. And it connects to the remote radio unit via a fiber optic cable using an interface standard called CPRI, so the Common Public Radio Interface. And one of the issues with CPRI is it's a proprietary protocol developed by Ericsson, Huawei, NEC, and Nokia. So you have your traditional deployment model has proprietary hardware at the RRU level, proprietary hardware and proprietary software at the baseband unit level, and proprietary interfaces. And you can almost see the inevitable consequences of vendor lock-in and a curb on innovation in the radio access network. So if you can go to the next slide. And so in essence, we've got this vendor concentration in the UK. So the top 5 vendors in the RAN market account for more than 95%. And this concentration of market share has got some advantages, but for operators that buy and operate RAN equipment, there are also some downsides. So limited availability of suppliers and reduced competition. And as we've seen with what's been happening with the government's decision in various countries across the world, this limit of viable, scalable equipment vendors has now become a critical problem. And the knock-on effect, I think, has been that large vendors often favor integrated products under their exclusive control, which means that operators can face potentially elongated product development timelines, and innovation at the subsystem level almost gets buried beneath their large OEM brand. And so you get a lack of software control and feature development. So it can be harder for operators and independent software developers to gain control over the RAN equipment due to these proprietary interfaces and licensing restrictions. So we can go to the next slide. And so, yeah, on this slide, it's a bit of empirical data. This is taken from a heavy reading survey of over 70 operators across the globe and asking them what they thought were their key business justifications for Open RAN. And top, unsurprisingly, is increasing vendor diversity. But interestingly, that's not the only issue. And I think if you take away one thing from this part of the talk, it's that this is not just about vendor diversity. Operators are looking to Open RAN to improve coverage in new and or marginal geographies. So rural areas, private networks, I think you're going to see the initial Open RAN deployments are likely to be in those more rural areas in terms of the footprint of the operator. And you can see this by Vodafone's recent announcement that they're going to use Open RAN in at least 2,500 sites by 2027. And those sites are pretty much exclusively in rural areas in the southwest of England. So if we can go on to the next slide. So key features, just to summarize: vendor diversity, a best of breed for different network elements, new service capability, so automation of network setup to make network slicing easier. Network development's more flexible because you've got software-defined networking. There's a potential for a reduced product development lifecycle. And at the bottom of the slide, there are also cost considerations, because in essence, the radio access network makes up about 60% of the CapEx and OpEx spend for operators. So it's the most important cost factor for network operators. So what we'll do now is go on to discuss the various standards bodies and what initiatives they are bringing to bear. So if you can click on. So yeah, I mean, we've picked out 3 standards bodies here, but we could have had more. We could have included things like the Small Cell Forum. So the 3GPP, that unites 7 regional standards organizations, and their role is to ensure there's a level of global standardization for different technical developments in the telecom sector. So if you listened into the second webinar, we went through the timeline in terms of release 15, 16, and 17, which are the 3 releases that sort of introduce new functionality and standardization for 5G. And the other standards bodies here, you've got the Telecom Infra Project, which is an industry alliance founded by Facebook, with a board of directors from companies such as Intel, Nokia, Vodafone, Telefonica, and BT. And the overall aim of TIP is to create network architectures that improve the infrastructure that operators use. And then the O-RAN Alliance, which was founded in 2018 as an amalgamation of the C-RAN Alliance, which was formed by China Telecom and other mainly Chinese vendors, and the X-RAN Forum, which was US, European, Japanese, and South Korean vendors such as AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, Orange, and NTT Docomo. So you think, well, actually, why is there a need for these different standards bodies? And I guess the 3GPP standards on interfaces are predominantly open, and so what we'll do in the next few slides is just talk about why the O-RAN Alliance and TIP needed to be formed. So you remember when we looked at the traditional RAN, we spoke about the base band unit and the remote radio unit. So connections between the core network and the radio access network use an S1 3GPP interface, which is completely open. So you have no issues here. Where you do get issues is in the release 15 for 5G, the baseband unit is now split between a centralized unit and a distributed unit. And it introduces the mid-haul functionality. And the issue with that is that interface, F1, is not open. And also connections between the E node Bs and G node Bs within 4G and 5G rely on an X2 interface. It's 3GP defined, but it's an optional interface. And what vendors have been doing is to use proprietary messages over this interface, which has made it more difficult to introduce new vendors as operators have been rolling out 5G in non-standalone format. So when we spoke about CIPRI earlier on, Obviously, that's a proprietary interface developed by Ericsson, Nokia, and NEC. The O-RAN Alliance has been looking to remove CPRI and replace it with eCPRI, so that you now have open interfaces in that middle part of the network. And the Small Cell Forum has introduced INFAPI, which is the Network Femto API. So the whole issue of open interfaces is about creating an ecosystem where there is less reliance on the traditional vendors, so the Ericssons, Nokias, and Huawei's of this world. So if we can now flick on to the next slide. Yeah, and so this drive towards open interfaces, the objectives are to break the monolithic chain of technology into smaller chunks, because it's easier said than done, particularly when you look at things like single RAN technology. But the objective is to enable new entrants to the market who've got a narrower focus and give them a lower entry point to the market, with the overall objective of having best in breed technology in a particular subsystem within the network. So that's the promised land, if you like, and one of the potential promises of Open RAN and the O-RAN Alliance. So if we can go on to the next slide. So this is, if you like, the ideal scenario. So you've got your core network services on top of the core network, the transport network in the middle, and then the radio access network. The overall objective, which I suspect will take probably the best part of the 2020s to actually realize, is for the access network to be using Open RAN software and open hardware, which you can source from any ODM or OEM or RAN vendor, so that you can actually swap these devices in and out without causing significant disruption and having to rely on proprietary interfaces. So we can go to the next slide. So this all, so far so good. Seems that there's a relatively common view about within the industry about the direction of travel. What are the potential barriers to adoption? So the first is the request for single RAN technology, which we'll discuss when we get to the next slide. There are probably 4 barriers to adoption. So single RAN technology, the non-standalone deployments, and some of the interface issues relevant to them. Then you've got 2G and 3G legacy technology issues. And also, lastly, operational issues. How do you go about maintaining your network if you're a network operator with an almost infinite supply of potential vendors? And I think that the answer is that operators like the idea and really welcome diversity of choice within the vendor community, but I still think they're going to concentrate around 2 or 3, maybe 4 different vendors when they look to do their 5G deployments. So we can go on to the next slide. So single RAN technology, I think, is a significant impediment, or it's certainly a hurdle that needs to be overcome if Open RAN is, if the vision of Open RAN is going to be realized. So I've picked out 2 operators and looked at their vendors in their radio access network prior to the July decision to require those operators to remove Huawei from the network by 2027. So in effect, Vodafone, for all generations of technology, they use Huawei and Ericsson, and for BT, they use Nokia in their 3G access network, and then Huawei and Nokia in different in the 2G, 4G, and 5G. And with all this talk about evolving technology, I think there's one thing there's a few things that are worth bearing in mind. For some operators, currently 50% of their voice calls still use the 2G and 3G networks. And there are millions of consumers in the UK who've got phones that can only operate with the 2G and 3G networks. And in addition, at the corporate level, a lot of devices, sensors, and smart meters still rely on the 2G network. And so for any replacement technology, 2G capabilities have to be a critical part of the solution until 4G and 5G devices are essentially omnipresent. And if you start looking beyond the Nokias and Ericssons of this world, so if you pick someone like Samsung, one of the issues with Samsung is that they've not invested heavily in 2G and 3G technology, because they see it as a dying technology, which means that to deploy their equipment at scale, you may need another vendor to provide the 2G and 3G aspect of the solution, or deploy an overlay network, which again is easier said than done. So what we'll discuss now is the non-standalone deployments and some of the issues there on the next slide. Yeah, so non-standalone is essentially where you use the 5G radio access network with the 4G core. So in non-standalone mode, 5G new radio base stations connect to 4G LTE base stations via the X2 interface. And that's a 3GPP optional interface. And what has happened in practice is that vendors have used proprietary messages over this interface, which has made using different vendors within the network more difficult, particularly if that X2 interface is not open. In terms of overlay solutions, the difficulty with those is that you need to build a 5G solution coherently with your existing vendors, so that a consumer with a 5G handset gets the maximum experience if they can also make use of existing 4G networks. If you remove that option, the 5G experience can deteriorate quite badly. And there's also, for those overlay solutions, a need for large bands of contiguous spectrum, which is hopefully going to get easier with the recent announcement about 3.6, 3.8. But operators don't have large amounts of unused spectrum just lying around. So what do we think, given this backdrop, the likely profile of early Open RAN deployments in the UK is going to be? So if we can go to the next slide. So we think if you look at Vodafone's announcement that it's going to use Open RAN at a minimum of 2,600 radio sites by 2027, it started its vendor evaluation process, it's selecting suppliers next year, and it's going to begin deployments in 2022. So I think that is a message to the industry that Open RAN is on its way. And I think part of the rationale for Vodafone really putting a strong message out there is to encourage innovation and smaller vendors and to develop test beds and incubators so that you start to develop the market for innovation in the UK. But I think that the reality is that early deployments will be probably rural, small cell deployments, private network deployments, and then you'll start to see towards the middle of the 20s large scale adoption as a second wave, and that's borne out by the next slide, which again is a heavy reading slide. So we can just go to the next slide. Yeah, so vendors were asked, in terms of readiness for commercial deployment, how mature do you think Open RAN products and architectures are today? So only 13% of vendors think it's mature for large-scale deployment. And I think actually that may overstate the UK position, because this survey included jurisdictions like the US, China, and Japan, where they've gone for 5G standalone technology. So I think large-scale deployment isn't really going to happen anytime soon, and these more bounded scope deployments will probably be how the early adoption of Open RAN is going to pan out. So with that sort of setting of the scene, I'll now hand over to James, who will talk through some of the security challenges and network challenges that operators will face.
Thanks, Paul. Now, security of 5G networks has probably become one of the most politicized issues affecting the telecoms industry in recent times. And that's partly because there's such a wide range of new applications in a 5G world, ranging from enhanced mobile broadband through to all sorts of ultra-low latency comms and massive machine communications. These applications show huge promise and also give rise to additional security issues compared to previous generations of networks. So governments and regulators around the world have been grappling with cybersecurity issues posed by 5G for some time now, and legislation to implement government policy is yet to be finalised in many jurisdictions, including the UK. Taking a look at the threat landscape of 5G, I suppose all communications networks have security issues, and we've seen a huge growth in cybersecurity risks and threats since the beginning of the current pandemic as well. 5G itself can provide a greater level of security in some respects, but the reality is that 5G architecture can also be exposed to a greater level of new risk threats. So a large volume of threats posed to 5G networks are fairly generic and exist in previous generations like 3G and 4G, and these range from the usual categories of threats such as user-side threats, supply chain threats, internet threats, and signaling threats as well. But what has probably added some extra concern around security to 5G can be summarized in a few areas. First of all, there's a range of new use cases for critical applications arising from 5G. Just as earlier generations of mobile networks promoted new technologies, starting with mobile voice, moving through messaging and on to sort of basic internet, and then with 4G, developed a thriving sort of app economy. Many expect a similar but potentially exponential growth in use cases for 5G, including critical things like managing autonomous vehicles through to utilities, and that does increase the importance of security in those networks. The second factor that is of particular relevance to 5G is the growth in virtualization and software-defined networking, and that means a growth in software threats to the network. While software has always been a significant part of existing mobile networks, 5G promises to significantly raise the bar in terms of software deployment and the disaggregation of network functions, as you've heard from Paul's presentation, from the physical equipment on which it's installed, exposing networks to further cloud and internet threats. The lack of diversity in the supply chain for 5G networks, which Paul highlighted, also creates some security concerns because there's a limited number of existing vendors and they all source some form of industrial manufacturing capability from countries like China. The UK government approach certainly has been to presume threats in the supply chain, not only for high-risk vendors but also for other vendors who make use of manufacturing chains from countries like China. Now, that lack of diversity in the supply chain also creates a concentration risk, so that if there is a security issue arising from one vendor's kit, then that has significant effects on the entire network if you're operating under the current proprietary models. The move to mobile edge computing also poses some interesting differences in security because it prevents the use of traditional perimeter defense systems and trust structures that have existed in previous generations of mobile network, and it requires that to be changed so that trust is actually removed from the network, and there's a higher degree of emphasis on authentication, encryption, and security in between the different components in the network. Finally, a common threat is the fact that there are going to be so many more devices and more connections in the 5G world, particularly with the growth of the Internet of Things, that results in a much greater attack surface. And so this is obviously a concern for 5G. Now, if we move to the next slide, there are some additional specific security issues for Open RAN, and this results largely from the open architecture nature of the system. So the first thing is that there will inevitably be a greater use of open source software within the network. Some of the existing standards are based around Linux code and the like. And so when we're not dealing with proprietary code systems, you don't necessarily have the same degree of control over the code that gets into the software platform, and it does require greater vetting. Open architecture also means that there's no single end-to-end security solution in an Open RAN environment. Having a range of suppliers in different elements of the network means that there is a greater attack surface, and you have to look at securing each element of the network rather than looking at single end-to-end security solutions. There are also specific elements of architecture and design with Open RAN which give rise to additional issues. So with multiple vendors supplying different parts of the network, there needs to be standards around mutual authentication, resolution of signaling conflicts which can be exploited by attackers, and sharing of hardware resources for different software applications can create its own threats. And much of this is not, exclusive. You still have, traditional potential impact from, physical attacks on the network. We've seen disruptions from, attacks on 5G mast sites due to some of the coronavirus conspiracies that have been floating around. And so physical security still needs to be ensured on the network, even if we move to Open RAN. But having said all that, there are a lot of benefits from Open RAN in terms of security, according to many in the industry. So the first thing is that the standardization bodies are playing a really key role in developing security requirements for Open RAN environments, and that includes 3GPP, the O-RAN Alliance, and so forth. Now, by doing that, it creates a lot more transparency over security in the network compared to proprietary solutions, which are often much more opaque when you're dealing with individual vendors who have a lot more control over their own development processes. The additional benefit in terms of security is the fact that there will be improved diversity when rolling out Open RAN networks. And by having that diversity in the supply chain, it mitigates against concentration risk. In particular, if one particular vendor suffers security issues with their kit, the overall network will not be as reliant on that particular vendor, and there's more capabilities to swap around in terms of what network resources are being used to deliver the service. Now, there are a number of sort of key regulatory principles which we should look at, having looked at some of the broad attack threats and the threat landscape for 5G and Open RAN, because these are developing. And what we've seen is that while security of communications networks and services is not a new concern, there has been a substantial movement in terms of the standards of regulation over the past few years. Now, there are a range of legislative devices there on this slide, ranging from the GDPR and the Data Protection Act, which protects personal data and does extend to obviously the personal data that travels over a communications network, including content data and traffic data over a network. We've also got the e-privacy directive and the PECA in the UK, which has specific security requirements that apply to providers of public electronic communications services. And the Communications Act builds on top of that so that it specifically applies security requirements to network providers and service providers, and it goes beyond just measuring sort of appropriate technical and organizational measures to looking at specific security risks, risks to end users, risks to interconnection, and risk to availability. And it's worth saying that availability and resilience of services has been a continuous trend in terms of regulation, and it's becoming quite prevalent in terms of standards that these things are looked at. Now, we've also got more industry-specific regulation coming about, so that the Network and Information Security Directive, which has been implemented in the UK, applies to operators of essential services and digital service providers, but it requires appropriate technical and organizational measures to be taken to ensure the security of their network and information systems that they use. So it's an indirect regulation of communications networks, essentially, in order to ensure that they are secure. Now, we do have a new piece of European legislation, the European Electronic Communications Code, which does actually increase the standard of security for communications providers. It follows very similar standards to the other security standards we've seen in the legislative regimes we've already highlighted. But what it does mention in terms of communications network is it does list and highlight encryption as an additional standard. Now, in terms of the implementation in the UK, we've just had the Telecoms Security Bill tabled in Parliament today, and that's the UK instrument which is intended to actually implement the new EECC standards into UK law. If we move to the next slide, what we're seeing is a difference in approach to the development of 5G regulation in the EU compared to the UK, and that's been driven partly by the highly politicized nature of the review of 5G security in the United Kingdom. Now, if we have a look at the EU approach, the EU approach is very much principles-based regulation, but with additional guidance. And so the EU has followed the approach of setting out, a 5G recommendation, which then resulted in a coordinated risk assessment across member states, and it's fed its way into, an EU toolbox that member states and operators can look at in order to ensure appropriate level of security in their 5G networks. What the UK has done, it has worked with the EU in terms of this sort of coordinated risk assessment approach, but because of its own geopolitical status, it has decided to take a different approach. So if we look at the UK's telecom supply chain review that was conducted last year, that resulted in finding in January, which restricted high-risk vendors from the core parts of 5G networks, and also put a cap on the percentage of the radio access network that could be supplied by high-risk vendors by 2023. Now, what we've seen since then is a hardening of the UK's stance towards high-risk vendors, and much of that resulted from US sanctions, which were imposed against China. And what that meant was that there's certain US technology that has traditionally been used by high-risk vendors in China, which was no longer available to the likes of Huawei in terms of their equipment and software development. And that resulted in the National Cybersecurity Centre reassessing its recommendations to the government, which resulted in a July statement to effectively ban high-risk vendors from networks in the UK in terms of mobile networks and full fibre by 2027. and no one's allowed to place orders for further equipment from the end of this year from those high-risk vendors. That has only now found its way into today's telecoms security bill. Now, we're still waiting to see how the text is tabled in Parliament today, but just to run through a couple of the key headline points on the telecom security bill. First of all, telecoms providers will need to take appropriate action to bring in minimum security standards for their networks and services and to limit damage of any breaches, and that includes the ability for regulators to remove high-risk vendors from networks. Now, the specific security requirements themselves will be set out in secondary legislation, and so that will not be prescribed in the bill, and we'll need to see how the bill proceeds through Parliament. But ultimately, it sounds as if there will be powers for ministers or for regulators like Ofcom to actually impose specific security requirements by means of secondary legislation. In addition to those specific security requirements, new codes of practice will demonstrate how providers should comply with their legal obligations, and those codes of practice will be published following royal assent. Now, critically, and what's been taking the headlines this morning is that Ofcom's role will include carrying out technical testing, interviewing staff and entering operators' premises to view equipment and documents in terms of exercising new powers to monitor the security of networks. And Ofcom will be given the power to levy fines up to 10% of turnover or £100,000 per day for continuing contraventions. And so that's quite an increase compared to other regulatory powers that have existed around security. And I think we need to sort of see how the legislation is drafted to see how that turnover calculation will actually be formulated. It's not uncommon for Ofcom to enjoy the ability to levy 10% fines under, for example, the general conditions of entitlement, but that's always been measured according to relevant turnover rather than a broader measure of turnover for the business. So we'll have to see how that's drafted to judge the impact. If we move to the next slide, what does that mean? I mean, what are the practical issues really for operators when rolling out 5G and new Open RAN solutions? Well, I think the first issue is that 5G is happening now. Operators are already pursuing their plans, and that includes plans that Paul has mentioned around Open RAN networks. Now, one of the challenges of that is that there's not yet any clear regulatory standards in place around security. And we're still, waiting to see how this telecom security bill progresses through Parliament, and then to see how specific security develops through secondary legislation in order for operators to be able to meet their requirements. So that does create uncertainty when this commercial activity is taking place as we speak. Now, standardization bodies, as we've seen from Paul's presentation, they're providing really useful guidance on matters which include security, but those standards still require quite a high degree of interpretation by operators for the purpose of implementing those standards. And there is still a degree of discretion when implementing those standards as to how networks should be configured, even in an Open RAN environment. So that means that there's still a degree of uncertainty as to how operators should satisfy their security requirements. Now, it's already difficult for operators to pass security standards down supply chains, but we do have an added complexity of an Open RAN ecosystem, which will require a new security framework. It's somewhat easier to impose contractual requirements and security standards on a single vendor, but in a complex ecosystem, operators will need to put in place robust procedures in order to ensure security across the whole of their networks, even though different elements might be provided by a range of different vendors. Another issue is the sort of incremental nature of 5G development and transitioning to Open RAN. And what we've seen is that the UK has primarily adopted a non-standalone approach to 5G deployment at the moment, but in the future that may well transition into Open RAN. So what that means is that there is a challenge in implementing new standards over legacy sites, which may not be interoperable with Open RAN sites in the future. So to the extent that 4G networks are still involved in 5G supply, I think there is some uncertainty as to how the security of those 4G network elements will be secured to modern standards that are going to be imposed from a regulatory perspective on 5G networks. Just a few final points here. The technological neutrality of telecoms security regulation is also seemingly at odds with the UK government's desire to take more control over security standards in the UK. So watch this space, but one of the challenges will be setting out robust security standards which are appropriate for 5G and Open RAN, while still having a neutral regulatory model so that those can also be applied to full fibre and 4G and other sorts of network which are involved in these ecosystems. And finally, I think one of the future challenges which we'll have to see how it develops is the threat of having multiple regulators with competence over security related issues. So we've seen with the Telecom Security Bill and the Communications Act that Ofcom has a key role to play, but yet the ICO is the primary regulator in terms of data protection and also privacy regulation. There's an added layer of sector-specific regulation in terms of the Network and Information Security Directive as well, so that, for example, for utilities and other operators of essential services, they have their own regulators that will have competence in dealing with issues that arise in relation to network and information security systems. So I think one of the challenges for operators will be managing dual or multiple regulation, which could create issues with coordination, consistency, and also funding for the regulators. So that's the conclusion on the security aspects of this presentation, and I think now we can see if there are any questions, unless there's anything else from you, Paul, to sum up on.
No, nothing more from me. I mean, I think this will probably be the last 5G webinar we do in 2020, but I think one of the things we'll focus on in the first quarter of 2021 is actually what this means, what Open RAN will mean in terms of the regulatory landscape. Because I think actually, if you look at 5G and actually spectrum getting directly awarded to businesses as opposed to network operators, I think this starts to alter the emphasis in terms of telecoms regulation. So I think there'll be quite a lot of regulatory initiatives that we'll focus on in Q1. And so we've got just one question, or time for one question, and that's it's on the telecom security side. Just one for you, James. What's the sort of likely? The question is, what's the sort of likely timeline in terms of the bill getting published today and actually having finalised regulations that operators are required to comply with?
Sure. I mean, that's going to be on everyone's mind, I think. I think we need to wait to see what timescales are published when it's actually debated in Parliament. There's been a big emphasis from for example, the Defence Committee's review of 5G security, which was published in October, which very much encouraged the government to get the security bill in place before the end of the year. Now, I doubt that this bill will be able to be, fully implemented by then, but the government has been committing, for example, to implement certain aspects of the European Electronics Communications Code within the timescales before the end of the year, and the security requirements of the EEC are intended to be part of this. So I would expect this to probably follow quite an aggressive legislative timescale, particularly because actually a lot of the specifics of the regulation will be dealt with via secondary legislation. And because the government has firmly made a decision on some of these 5G issues from July, I suspect that many aspects of this regulation will be seen as merely implementing existing government policy. So it'll be interesting to see how much debate and how much trouble there actually is getting this bill through Parliament, given that the position on high risk vendors and the importance of security to 5G has been such a highly high profile issue over the last 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the sense that your countrymen have issued the Security and Critical Infrastructure Act, I think yesterday, so giving the Signals Directorate in Australia step-in powers, which should almost puts it at the front of the pack. So I think actually there'll be some useful analogies we can draw because Australia is obviously part of the Five Eyes sort of consortium with the UK, New Zealand, and the States. So actually, I think that this isn't just the UK issue. This is something that's happening, in particular within the Five Eyes consortium.
That's right, and we've also got obviously a critical piece of legislation going through which regulates foreign direct investment in critical sectors, and that includes communications. So I think there's a range of legislation that the UK is trying to pass, which will increase control around security in essential industries and critical infrastructure, and 5G is part of that. So I think there will be a strong political will to get both of those pieces of legislation through quickly.
Yeah, and certainly investors have been invested in the sector have been keeping a really keen eye on that. Obviously, working out what the parameters of that legislation will be. Well, that's all we have time for. But thanks again for your time spent in listening in, and we'll be in touch early in 2021 with a new series of webinars.